Here we are, grade 6, starting a new novel study. It's called Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. This is my favorite grade 6 novel study, so I'm really excited that we're going to be starting it. But before we do actually get started, this book is a historical fiction novel, which means that the characters are fiction, they are made up. But it's set in a place and a time that actually did happen in history. So, in order to understand this novel, we actually have to do a bit of a history lesson first. Okay, and we're actually going to start by jumping back to some of the history that we have learned and also mentioned in our work in grade 6 so far. So, we started out by learning about the Middle Ages right at the beginning of the year. And if you remember, the Middle Ages, they began in the 400s and they lasted to about the 1400s. And the Middle Ages, they take place after the events of the Bible, right? A couple hundred years after the life of Jesus. That's when the Middle Ages happened. Then we learned a little bit about the Renaissance in our last novel study when we talked about the angel statue. Remember, that was carved by Michelangelo, one of those artists from the Renaissance. But you might remember we also mentioned the Renaissance back when we talked about the Middle Ages because we used it as kind of the end point of the Middle Ages. So it goes from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. And the Renaissance lasted from the 1400s to the 1700s. Now, something that we didn't really spend a lot of time talking about, I think we mentioned it, was that during the Renaissance, so after the Middle Ages, a lot of exploration was happening. So I'll jump to the map here. So people in European nations over here, originally they were trying to get to this area of the world because you could get things there that could not be produced in Europe, such as spices and silks and things like that. And they were looking for an option to travel to this eastern area of the world over here by boat rather than by land. It was quite dangerous to go by land. But what ended up happening was all these European nations were sending out explorers to try and get to that part of the world, and they ended up finding more than they expected. So you'll see a lot of lines going over towards North America. So at this time, the European nations discovered that North America existed, that there was some more land than they knew about. They also discovered all sorts of different parts of the world. You can just take a brief look at all the lines that are going across this map, all sorts of different places that they didn't necessarily know about before, or at least they didn't know very much about them before. All right, so European exploration. Now, what ended up happening with European exploration was the people in these European nations would set up what are called colonies in new places. So they would send people over to new places. They called these new lands that they discovered the New World. And what they wanted those colonies to do was to produce goods and basically to make money for their nation. So in North America, they were setting up colonies to gather the natural resources. So cut down lumber, fishing, furs. And one of the ones that became really important, especially in the southern portion of the United States, was the crop of cotton. Okay, so here is a picture of cotton, and you'll notice, oh dear, I have a little highlighted section. Just erase that for you for a sec. So you'll notice that these plants have little puffs, little white puffs on them, and they look like cotton balls that you could buy at the store. But these plants are used, these little puffs or balls of fibrous material are used to create fabric, so cotton, textiles, fabric. Now, when we learned about the United States in social studies, we talked a little bit about the climate. So the climate is really good in the southern United States for growing the crop of cotton. It does really well there. So they started growing cotton, and cotton is the type of plant that you need a lot of manual or human labor for. Each of those puffs of cotton has to be hand-picked. You need lots of people to do all of the things that have to do with farming of cotton. So in order to make money on cotton crops, a farmer would need to have lots and lots of help, lots and lots of human labor to be able to create a profit from cotton. Now, something else that happened during the Age of Exploration was the people in Europe, they were traveling also along Africa here. You can see that on the lines. And what they would do is they would actually capture the people that lived in Africa, and take them by force to come and work in North America as slaves. So these people, they were removed from their family forcibly. They were taken, they were captured, they were brought to North America, and they had to do hard labor. And they didn't have any freedom at all whatsoever. They were brought here, to the southern United States to work on these cotton plantations. They were treated very, very, very terribly. So we've got a picture here of some illustrations of the slave trade. So these people from Africa were treated by by the white people that lived in North America now as less than human, right? They would be sold like just like you would auction off an animal. Slaves were treated as subhuman, definitely not at the same level. And horrible things would happen, like, for instance, sometimes when they were selling off slaves, families would be split apart. Husband and wife might be sold to different plantations, a mother and a child. Really, really terrible, terrible, awful things. And for these people who were enslaved, depending on who their owner was, depending who their master was, they could be treated very, very cruelly. So really a terrible, terrible life for these people who had been taken from their homeland and now are forced to work on these cotton farms, also known as cotton plantations. So the first African slaves were brought to North America in the year 1619. Okay, the United States becomes a country in 1776, and we're going to learn more about that when we get back to school, and we can talk a bit more in detail about American history. But by the year 1860, there were actually 3.9 million slaves in the USA, mostly in those southern states. Okay, 3.9 million people. And at this point, they wouldn't have been necessarily taken directly from Africa. The first slaves were, but these would be more likely the descendants of those original slaves. So people had been taken from Africa, and then they were captured. They lived their lives in captivity. They had children. Their children became slaves. Their children's children became slaves. Now, slavery did not last forever in the United States. The Civil War happened from 1861 to 1865, and the main thing that the Americans were fighting about was the right to own slaves. So if you look at this map here, we have a map of the United States, and a civil war, grade 6, just means a war within a nation. So it's not two different countries fighting against each other. It's fighting that's happening within the country itself. Okay, so down here in red, we have the southern states, and that's where they were growing a lot of the cotton. That's where they had all of those slaves. And then we had the northern states, the blue ones, and the North was basically saying slavery is wrong, you cannot own people. And the South, they really wanted to keep slavery. For hundreds of years, they had slaves. They were making lots of money on these cotton plantations, and that was the main issue that the two sides were fighting about. Okay, so the Civil War in the 1860s. Now, in the Civil War, the northern states, so the ones that were saying no to slavery, were the ones who won. And the slaves were freed through the Emancipation Proclamation, which just means a declaration that all slaves are free. So by the 1860s, slavery is illegal in the United States. You cannot own another person anymore. But it's not so simple as just freeing all of the slaves. Okay, so back to the 1860s, the Civil War ends. But after the Civil War, the people who had been in slavery didn't have a lot of options for what they could do. So you have to imagine here, if somebody has been a slave their whole life since birth, they haven't been able to get an education, first of all. They wouldn't have known how to read or write. They wouldn't have had a lot of skills other than just farming skills. They also would not have been able to make their own money. Remember, they were being forced to work for their owners. They wouldn't have any savings, any money. They wouldn't have access to a lot of food or clothing or the things that they needed to survive. So, what ended up happening after the slaves were freed was something that was called sharecropping. Okay, and here you got to get ready for another one of Miss Nyhoff's terrible pictures. So let's imagine this is a cotton plantation. This is land that is owned by this man right here. Oh boy, that's a terrible man. You get the idea. Now, this man used to have a whole bunch of people who were slaves working on his land, okay? And he used to own them, he used to be in control of them, and he kept them working on his land by force. After they were freed, after the Civil War, suddenly these people who were in slavery are free. They don't belong to this man anymore, but they don't really have any way to support themselves or to keep their families alive. So what ended up happening was the white landowners would still own the land, but now instead of having these people work in slavery for him, he would strike up a deal with them. He would give them things that they needed, like seeds and farming tools, and basically he would kind of split up his land, and then each of these slaves or these previous slaves and their families would work on a different section of his land. So you'd say, I'll give you seeds, I'll give you farming tools, and then at the end, once the harvest has come in, you give me part of the profits and you can keep some of the profits for yourself. Okay? And we're going to look in more detail as we go through this book at really what sharecropping is. It sounds right now like kind of a good deal, but we're really going to see that it's not quite slavery, but it's pretty close, because these people who had been enslaved to this man really are still bound to his land and have to do what he says in order to survive. Okay, so just keep that in mind. That's what's going to be happening with a lot of the characters in our book, and we'll go over that in more detail coming up. Now, another thing is that we have to know about before the book begins: segregation laws. So in these southern states, for hundreds of years, people had been treating other people with black skin. So the white people were treating the black people like they were less than human. They were basically animals, maybe even less than animals. They'd been treating them really, really terribly. And the white people had come to this idea that they were somehow better, that they were a better level of humanity just because of the color of their skin, okay, which is completely wrong and terrible. But this is 100% what they believed, okay? So after the slaves had been freed, what the white people in power did was they enacted these segregation laws, and they're sometimes called Jim Crow laws. You might hear those as well. But basically the idea with these laws was to try and make sure that based on the color of skin, white people and black people would be kept as separate as possible. The white people did not want to associate with these black people at all. Okay? And the whole point of segregation laws was to keep that separation. So I have a couple of pictures here for you that give you a few examples of what these segregation laws were like. So there would be separation in almost every area of life. So you see this first picture up here. We have two separate drinking fountains, one for if you are white or one for if you are colored, if you have black skin. Okay, they weren't allowed to use the same water fountain. The same went for things like bathrooms. There would be separate bathrooms. There would be separate schools. If you were white, you would go to a different school than if you were black. Okay, or even here you can see this advertisement for a laundry company. We wash for white people only, right? Really trying to keep the separation. Because the white people still wanted to feel superior or better than the people that they had been enslaving for all of these years. And one of the phrases that go with these segregation laws is the idea of being separate but equal. But we're really going to see that in the experience of the characters in our book, there is definitely separation, but there is no equality. Okay, so we're going to look more closely at these segregation laws as well in our novel. Then the last thing that we have to know about is that this book takes place in the 1930s, or the Great Depression. Scroll back up here, we did segregation laws. So the Great Depression in the 1930s. Now, we'll go over this in more detail once again when we talk about American history. But just for the purposes of this book, know that in the 1930s, things were very, very difficult for a lot of people. The Great Depression is a time when it was very difficult for people to make money. There were not a lot of jobs to be had. There were all sorts of people who were unemployed, who couldn't find a way to make money for their family. So this was a very, very difficult time in American history for both Black and white people. But we're going to see in this book that where our characters are in the southern states, it is even more difficult for them because they are Black, because those segregation laws are in place, and because the white people treat them so terribly. Okay, so you can even see a couple pictures here. These are a couple of famous pictures from the Great Depression, right? People living in very, very poor conditions, small houses, not having a lot of food, not having a lot of what they need. And then even here in this picture, right, help wanted, white only. So businesses were saying that were owned by white people were saying, we're not going to hire you if you are Black. So a lot of challenges for these African American people during this time as well. All right, I'm kind of losing my voice here, but a few very, very important points we still need to go over. So some important things to remember when we start the book. Number one, the story takes place in the 1930s, or the Great Depression, the time when it was very, very hard to make money, very, very difficult for people to survive. The next thing, the story takes place in a southern state. I'm not going to tell you which one because that's one of your comprehension questions, but it's important to know that it takes place in one of these southern states because of those segregation laws, that the white people and the Black people were kept separate because of those laws. All right, our main characters, it's going to be a Black family, so they're going to be facing a lot of challenges because of where they live and because of who they are. And then the next really, really important thing to remember is that our main characters here are not slaves. Okay, slavery officially ended in the 1860s, which would be about 70 years before the events of this book. Okay, so just don't think that just because the main characters are African American, because they're Black, and because they are treated so poorly that they are slaves. No, they are free. This book takes place after the slaves were freed. Okay? All right. Hopefully you can take all of that in. We're going to go over it more so when we get into the book. I am going to be reading from the book with videos, so be on the lookout for those coming soon as well.